So I'm Blake. I'm the Senior Director of Technology at Bench. And I'm going to mix things up a bit. I've actually loved the variety of types of presentations that have come today. I mean, we've had a sweet ML talk. We've had a talk about the movement of money. And now I'm going to talk about culture in the technological space. So this is great. So little about me. So I've been with Bench for about 4 years, but I'm leading the technology org for the last 2. Came from startups as an engineer, mostly front end. Interesting thing about me, I have a whole other different past life where I worked as a theater artist for a good chunk of my life, from when I was like 18 till I was about 26. I went to school for musical theater. I can sing and tap dance, which is a thing that I love to talk about now. And honestly, I used to be ashamed of in my early days. And so for any folks who are new that have a diverse background, now as a person who hires people, let me tell you, it's really, really, really interesting when folks can bring their other life experiences, especially into technology. I think it's such a powerful thing when we can have that diversity of experience on our teams. So that's why I tell that story. Other than that, I live in Squamish, British Columbia, which is directly in between Whistler and Vancouver. I spent a lot of time outside, and I have 2 daughters. My daughter Cleo is 2 and a bit, and my daughter Pippa is 5 months old. And I'm going to have to run right after this to pick one of them up from daycare. So that's my life. That's my holistic picture. A little about Bench. So we were founded in 2013. We're the biggest full service bookkeeper in North America. We actually got a letter once from Intuit asking us to prove that, and we said, no, that's just a thing that we say. When I say full service, I mean, we do the whole gambit. Like, you work with us, you send us your statements, you don't have to think about anything. We give you your books and your tax. So if you're thinking about us versus Wave is a significantly more software focused solution. So correct me if I'm wrong, Rizal, just throw a rock at me in the chat. And on the Bench side, we are a full service augmented by software. So that's a good way to differentiate the two of us. I love this convergence of banking and bookkeeping that's happening. Wave's doing it. We're doing it too. We're building a bank with the support of Stripe Treasury. We're in their early beta and we're releasing very soon. We actually already have some beta users. And what that's going to unlock for us is a very, very significantly more automated world where we can still deliver an amazing service. I have a feeling our product and Wave are actually going to start converging closer and closer. They've come at it from a completely different angle than we have, but it's going to be cool to see where we go. Bench is awesome. I love it there. The dreams are massive. The people are great. And there's a massive, massive focus on culture, which is why I'm here to talk about that. So today's talk is called A Test Suite for Our Culture. So what am I talking about? So 1, what is culture? 2, how do we define it? And 3, how do we change it? So what is culture? Like, we all know and have experienced culture. Culture is a thing that is around us all the time. We know that hiring is a massive part of culture. We know that management and leadership are a massive part of culture, but what is it? How do we access it? How do we touch it? How do we interact with it? The way we talk about this at Bench is that we can observe and experience culture by listening to and participating in the conversations at work. It's quite simple. Like, conversations just give us access to everything that is happening in the business, and conversations shape everything that has happened in the business. So when we think about it in that model, we can think about culture as the sum of all the conversations that have happened in a business and that are happening today and right now. And as I'm speaking right now, I'm having a conversation which is affecting the culture of Bench and affecting the culture of CAMDEA, right? Like, at all times, culture is being shaped by the conversations that we have. So that's a nice formula, right? I use double equals for JavaScript people. I miss an equal sign. That's okay. We can live with the double equals for this one. Just pretend I'm in a different language. What does that actually mean? So let's pretend we're at the pub. Again, God, do I ever miss the pub? I just would love to sit and have a pint with my friends and breathe in their droplets. It would just be so nice to be able to do that again. So let's say we're at the pub, group of friends sitting around a table and having a conversation. That group has a culture, right? They have shared experiences. They interrelate with those shared experiences via the conversations that they have. They discuss topics, they discuss sports, they discuss technology, they discuss theater, they discuss whatever, right? They have a shared history. So they're sitting around building their culture by having a conversation, and somebody at the table says something inappropriate. and there's this like moment, right? There's this like record scratch moment where you go, what do I do? So if we think about our equation, right? All the conversations we've ever had with a group of friends, that inappropriate thing that was said is our culture now. Like that person has changed the culture. So what do we do about it, right? How do we take action on this? I mean, there's three things we can do. We can reinforce that by like saying, ha ha ha, that's great, you're hilarious, you're the best. We can ignore it and pretend it never happened, and we can counteract it. We could say, you know, that's not okay, right? Regardless of which action we take, this inappropriate comment has influenced our culture and is now part of our culture. So I'm going to pretend that I'm like a part of the best group of friends ever, and the immediate thing that happens to an inappropriate comment is that somebody counteracts it. So here's a new equation. Here's our culture now. It's all the conversations we've ever had, plus the inappropriate thing that was said, plus a conversation about how that comment isn't acceptable. So what I love about this little pluses and equals thing is it shows how quickly you can diverge from an existing culture and how quickly you can go back to something that is consistent with what you consider to be the culture. What I love about this model and about this idea of conversations is that we are all culture creators. Culture is not a leadership thing. Culture is not a management thing. Culture is not a senior thing. Culture is a thing that every single person that we work with and interact with is doing hundreds of times every day. It's almost boring how incredibly constant this is. It's like the biggest form of CI. We're always changing our culture every time we open our mouths and say something. And that's a responsibility that we need to take on. And this is a responsibility that I love communicating with the people that I work with. You know, if they say like, oh, I don't like the way the culture is going. It's like, oh, great, you just made it worse with that conversation, right? Like that's, you have the power to make this culture better every time you say something. So what does that look like? The way I talk about this and the way we talk about this at Bench is we have a responsibility as culture creators to ask ourselves, is this conversation consistent with the culture that we're committed to creating? So when we look back to the pub, right, that inappropriate thing, inappropriate just means inconsistent, right? If we were a bunch of like jerks and somebody said something jerky, it wouldn't feel inappropriate. But because we have this shared history, because we have these conversations, this shared culture, when somebody said something that was inconsistent with it, there was a reaction, right? It was obvious. So we need to train ourselves to listen for those conversations that are inconsistent with the culture that we've created. So that's one thing to do with a group of friends at a pub. Very different thing to do at a large company, or really any company. Bench is 570 people now. We're spread out all across Canada. We got employees in the US. I have people on my team in South Africa. I have people on my team in Germany now. So we can't expect to have an around the table conversation anymore. Like this is not possible. Time zones, different verticals, different departments, different goals, right? Like there are conversations that are happening all across Bench for different reasons at different times between different people, often people who we never speak with, right? So at the company level, how do we answer this question? How do we say whether or not a conversation is consistent with the culture we're committed to creating? Well, that's why companies come up with principles, right? A lot of companies have principles. These are not a new idea, but this is kind of what they're for, right? Principles allow us to consistently answer that question, am I being consistent with the culture? So Bench has 5 bench-wide principles. They're what I call the like how we do it principles. They apply to everything we do, like every conversation, emails with clients, yada, yada, like everything we do cross-departmentally, you can apply these 5 principles. Keep it human, take a stand, be responsible, default open, and get scrappy. So when you think about the conversations that you're having, this always comes into my head. The principles provide boundaries in the areas in which you should converse, right? And if you go outside those boundaries, you're being inconsistent with the culture. So when you look back at it, often these things act in opposition with each other. So the be responsible principle is often in opposition with the get scrappy principle, right? We need to get scrappy in a way that doesn't shoot us in the foot, 6, 12 months from now. So that's how we create these little boxes. And these are great. Like I love the Bench principles and we talk about them all the time and we use them like in the exec team all the time at Bench. And for me, they were great. And there were aspects of the technology culture that I was really still dissatisfied with. So for me, I needed something more. So I needed to make a change to my culture. So specifically, I wanted to talk about what we do in addition to how we do it. So what like specifically does a technology org do and how can I ensure that we're having conversations that are consistent with that? I also wanted to build something from the ground up so that myself and my management team could really own this thing and really, really run with it. So I had absolutely no idea how to do that. No idea. I had zero idea how to define a culture, right? I knew that it was something that probably needed to be done, and I had no idea how. Fortunately, at Bench, we have a lot of leadership development support, and we have executive coaches who help me through this. And what they recommended was that in order to define the culture that you want, start by talking about what you're unsatisfied with, what you're dissatisfied with. So dissatisfaction, like important caveat, isn't a bad thing. It often has this like negative connotation. Dissatisfaction is just the impetus for change. Like we drink out of cups because drinking water out of our hands sucked and wasn't very good, right? Like I was fundamentally dissatisfied with how I used to drink water. So somebody invented a cup. Like it's not a crazy, scary thing. Dissatisfaction is what powers change, and it should be something we talk about all the time. So to discover the change you want to make, start by talking about what you're dissatisfied with. So that's what I did. I took a hard look at my organization. And by the way, by the time I'd done this, I'd been leading this organization for a year. So every aspect of the culture by that point was my fault. So I was also analyzing myself as a leader at this time. So there were 3 areas I was dissatisfied with, and I'll quickly summarize here. One was a culture I called smart people solving hard problems, which is technology was seen as the end rather than the means to an end. So when technology is the goal, when you call success, I have built a thing, you're optimizing for the wrong things, right? You start thinking about the cool technology or the fast technology as opposed to the impact that that technology has on real people. So that was one thing I was dissatisfied with. The other one's a thing called nice culture. Nice culture looks like everybody's happy, everybody gets along, people go out for lunch together, there's lots of laughs, great emojis, great participation in events. All of that stuff is really, really important. However, nice culture as implemented in my org had this dark side where there wasn't space for the conversations that are required to create growth and high performance on a team. So in a nice culture, when somebody stands up in front of the room and says, hey folks, we failed, the reaction is, how dare you tell me that I failed? As opposed to, yeah, we failed, what are we going to do about it, right? So nice culture had this dark side where things that were not nice were inconsistent with it, and that was a problem. And third is something called the estimation problem. So why the heck do we build systems, so in our case it was Scrum Agile, that are based on estimation when we readily acknowledge how bad we are at estimation? In fact, we so readily acknowledge it that we create systems to help us be bad at estimation, like using the Fibonacci sequence for story points. Like we have built systems upon being bad, and then we built systems upon that as well. So for me, that's just a fundamental problem because I could never commit on things to my stakeholders, right? Because there was always this risk that things might not be done within a certain amount of time because we never knew how long things would take until we got in there. So I'm not trying to solve estimation, but I was dissatisfied with the results of that system. So what did I do with this? Well, I took these 3 dissatisfactions to my management team, and we met a lot. We met for hours, several weeks in a row, and we really drilled these things. And what we came up with were what I call antidotes. We came up with principles that are the flip of 1, 2, 3 here that allow us to describe a culture that counteracts the things that we were dissatisfied with in these 3. So these are the antidotes, aka the high-level principles. So for smart people solving hard problems, we have a principle called create value, which the sum of that is, or the summary of that is, nothing that we do in technology matters unless it has an impact on a real human being. So it doesn't matter how fast it is. It doesn't matter how elegant the code is. It doesn't matter what code base or repo or any single element doesn't matter unless it has a real impact on a human being. So that's the create value principle. The second is the foster growth principle, which is all of the nice stuff that I described in nice culture, plus explicit space for having difficult, pokey, uncomfortable conversations that lead to high performance and growth. So of course we want to be in a good mood all the time, but when things aren't going in the way that they need to go in, and I love the way that we've already talked about growth in previous talks, like you need to encourage growth, and sometimes that means having conversations that don't feel very nice. So that's what foster growth makes space for. Finally, the estimation problem was solved by something called honor time. If folks haven't read Shape Up out of Basecamp yet, I really, really recommend that you do. We actually have our product development process based on that now, but one of the biggest learnings that I got from that book was a flip of the estimation problem. So what they suggested was, how long is it going to take is just simply the wrong question to ask. And the question we need to be asking is, how much time do I want to spend on this? That statement hit me like a freaking lightning bolt. Like, I was like, oh, wow, there it is. There is a position where I have power as opposed to a position where I am completely powerless. So when we talk about honor time, we're talking about time as a first-class citizen at Bench. So this applies to the projects that we do. This applies to our own workday. Like me, for example, how much time do I want to spend on something today? How do I honor my own time? To put that into words, like, I have a allotted amount of time for the sub-departments in my department and the executive team, and I base my meetings budget on that in a month. I honor my own time. So that's how we started describing the antidotes, the cultures that we want to have. And I still wasn't good enough. I still wanted more. Specifically, I wanted to define what needs to be true for us to be able to say we're being consistent with these principles. So it's one thing to say, like, oh, that's create value, sure. But like, what is the list of things that need to be true for us to actually be consistent with these principles? So this is where we came up with the concept of supporting principles. So for each of the high-level principles, we defined a list of axioms, assertions, whatever you want to call, that need to be true in order for us to say that we are being consistent with that principle. So I've provided some examples here. I'll rip through them really quick, but there's a bunch more that you can see. We have a handbook online on GitHub that you can read and look at the full list, which, by the way, isn't done. And I don't know if it ever will be. So create value. We measure the value create by how much it improves the lives of our customers. Okay, that's the thing that we need to talk about and whether or not that's happening. We are most likely to do high value work when we see it as necessary to advance a cause that we believe in. This is one of my personal favorites. If you don't care, why are you here? Foster growth. Growth happens when an individual continuously asks themselves, is this the best I could do? To grow, we must step into conversations that feel scary and uncomfortable. So there's really two sides to that coin. Like, the manager needs to be able to step into that conversation, and the person growing needs to take on their own growth. Finally, in honor time, we set deadlines to push ourselves to be creative in solving problems. So let's put the real interesting spin on time as a first-class citizen. If we limit the time that we spend on something, what we actually do is create a space in which we have to be creative. That's what I love about this principle, is you can ask folks to be creative with the scope of what they do and really, really start to care about what will actually create value for the customer. And necessary for that is that a timeline is most motivating when each person doing the work is personally committed to it. So if you just tell your team, you have 6 weeks for this, it's very different than, here's a problem, how are you going to be creative within the next 6 weeks to do it? So this is what this looks like. So high-level principles are like categories. They read as instructions for how to interact with each other for what we do. The supporting principles are a list of assertions that have to be true in order for us to say that we're being consistent with our culture. So this might have twigged something for some people, because that is basically what this talk is about. It was great. We did this. We did all this work with the managers, and absolutely nothing changed. We had succeeded in an academic exercise. Great. Now what? So the rubber hit the road yet. So what did we do about it? Well, okay, let's just quickly go over everything we had here, and then we'll talk about how the rubber hit the road. So culture is the sum of all conversations, and we are all culture creators. Principles provide instructions for having consistent conversations at scale. We can identify principles by digging into our dissatisfaction, and we can further understand these principles by defining what needs to be true for us to say that we're living them. So, this is the one I already talked about. We needed to practice. We needed to figure out, like, how do we actually use this thing? So here's what we did. I just monopolized my manager's calendars. I said, hey, folks, sorry, hour-long meeting every Thursday morning where we're going to practice this. And what we do is, in advance of the meeting, we write down conversations that didn't work for us, that didn't feel consistent, right? Like, let's just write down the ones that were like, oh, here's the thing that I need help with. We described these conversations to each other, and then we looked at a list of supporting principles, and we said, okay, flag that one, flag that one, flag that one. Or it just passes all of them, but it still feels smelly. I think we're missing a principle, right? We got to iterate on the actual list of supporting principles in that way. And this works like unit tests. It was so funny for us to realize, like, we didn't do this on purpose. We just got to a point where, like, a a list of assertions that need to be true in order for us to say that something passed. Oh yeah, those are unit tests. So essentially, for conversations that we knew were broken, we got to run them through the unit tests, understand what was broken about them, and then we could use that information to help us shape the next conversation to right the ship on the culture that had resulted from that inconsistent conversation. So I'll do I have time for an example, Adam? Okay, cool. So let's look at a somewhat sanitized thing that actually happened. So here's an example of an inconsistent conversation with our culture. So I'll read it out. Manager, in our last meeting, you identified that you have a lack of expertise in what you're working on, and we agreed that you would come up with some goals about how to get that expertise. Can you share what you came up with? The engineer says, to be honest, I didn't have time to think about this because of my current deadline. Manager, you know what? I totally get it. Let's come back to this when you're less busy. So that's a conversation I have had as a manager so many times, and it's not consistent with the culture that we describe. So this was brought forward by one of the managers, and we got to look at it, right? It failed a bunch of tests. The speed at which we learn is the most important factor in our ability to create value. So if we're not making space to learn, we're not going to be able to create value very well. Foster growth. Are they saying, is this the best I could do? No, they're letting themselves off the hook. Similarly, we must step into conversations that feel scary and uncomfortable. The manager's letting them off the hook. They're both letting yourselves off the hook. They're having the easy conversation, not the one that creates growth. And finally, honor time. Learning and doing are not separate endeavors. So if you don't have enough time to learn, you need to think about the scope of what you're doing because you've probably overloaded it. So through identifying the ways that this didn't pass the test, we were able to design the next conversation, which looked like this. Manager, last time we spoke, I left you off the hook. You used a deadline as an excuse for not prioritizing your own growth, and I let you do it. Your growth is at least as important as that deadline. So today, we're going to figure out how to make time for it. Engineer, to be honest, it's just really hard to find time to think about myself. So attempting to let themselves off the hook again. Manager, we find time for whatever we consider to be our top priority. Growth is a long-term investment and you need to keep making installments. So I'm asking you to raise the priority of your growth. This might result in a temporary slowdown in your project. To be clear, I'm okay with that. Can you take this on and give me your goals in your one-on-one next week? Engineer, epiphany moment. You know what? I've been putting this off for too long. I'll give them to you by tomorrow so we can review them async before our meeting. So, I mean, this conversation went perfectly, probably because I wrote it like a script. But what's really important is this does not let anyone off the hook. So we were able to be consistent with the foster growth principle. It also allows us and empowers the manager to give space to the person to take time for their own learning. And they're able to say, I feel good as a manager. I know that I'm being consistent with the culture, even if it might hurt this deadline or this project, to make space for their learning. So that's the power of this system.
That content that you just delivered was it was an absolute masterclass, mate, in culture. You know, I think if anybody, you know, to all the people that were listening, culture is going to be something that people talk about, but I don't think you really understand it and recognize it until you're involved in it on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, just for hiring managers who might be in here, if you have a bad culture, you will lose people. And hiring people is one of the most expensive endeavors. If you hire Joe or Jane Citizen, it's going to take, and they leave, it's going to take like I think the statistics are about 70 to 75% of that candidate's wage to backfill the role in time. So if you lose a 100K developer, it's going to cost you 75K to get the next developer up to speed. So attraction and retention in culture is huge. How do you think that an online and work from home style of work in this pandemic has affected culture at Benchit and the way you've been able to influence and manage that?
I think the most important thing that changes when you're not able to see people is that you can no longer rely on defaults. So it's impossible to get rid of like the small things that happen in a group setting when you're meeting for no reason. I mean, that, like, you lose about 15 to 50% of empathy immediately. So you need to design systems that are explicit around being empathetic. You need to design systems that account for somehow less meetings but more connection. it's really fucking hard. I'm not gonna lie. It has been such an incredible year to be a leader, because it's been such an incredible opportunity to learn.
Yeah, totally, mate. I could, everybody's in the same boat with this whole remote. And I think, look, to be fair, I think it's here to stay. I think whenever post-COVID is for the world, we're not going back to 40 hours a week. I'll put $1,000 on that. Nobody, as a developer, like, you'll be like, why do you want me in the 40 hours a week? Like, you need to have a balance. I think 3 to 2, 3 in office, 2 work from home, 2 in the office, 3 work from home is probably going to be the new norm going forward. Vincent has asked, how do you manage conflicting incentives like products and deadlines to balance out with culture? In the example you gave, someone will be unhappy if the engineer is late on a project. That's a valid point there, Vincent.
Yeah. This requires commitment from leadership and from the developers. So the way we run it is we invest a certain amount of time in a problem, and we're going to get the output of that investment, which is how effective our team is. So if somebody isn't able to achieve something, there's a couple things that could have gone wrong. One, we get the investment wrong, the timeline's too short. 2, we haven't built a team that's able to do it within that amount of time. Regardless, at the end of that period of time, we reevaluate if that project is still the most important thing to work on. And that requires, because we have had to throw out projects because they have been ineffective in a 6-week thing. We haven't finished something that's shippable, and we've had to say, you know what, that's sunk cost, and we're not going to keep kicking this can down the road. We're going to move on to the next thing that's most important, and that requires like serious buy-in across the business. So I had to really work to make sure that folks are on board with that potential possibility. But once that happened, we were like, oh, that's a thing that can happen. Okay, I'm going to start to get way more scrappy with the scopes that I actually take on, so that I can create value within that amount of time. And I'm sorry if I sound like a person who's parroting these principles, but in order to socialize them, I just say them all the time. It's like I am on purpose obnoxious about it.
Man, I think that's the thing. You can have what's going on up here, and then talking and saying and doing is the action of your words. So yeah, a lot of respect for wanting to implement this amazing culture that seems to be present. And it's not just, I think as well, some of our clients like, oh, we have an amazing culture, and it's like, well, to Vince's point, it's like, well, where is it on the priority? Is it so important that some deadlines are going to be late, or are you willing to sacrifice your culture for making the deadlines and putting the development of a staff member behind the 8 ball a little bit? So I think it says a lot about the culture of the business in how they prioritize it in the day to day. And like you said, it's a 1 hour Thursday, gents, or ladies and gents, this is a priority. How is the culture faring in this time with COVID?
Yeah, this one's hard. So I would like to say that it's been great. COVID helped accelerate the learning I needed to do to get to the place where I am now. Mm-hmm. Like I said, we lost all of our defaults. We lost having lunch together. We lost, smiling and waving at people in the office, coupling with people's intense anxiety over the health of the world, coupled with people living in 400 square foot boxes that they're not allowed to leave. This was really hard. And so in the middle of this, Bench decides to build a bank and completely change the way that we build everything. So we didn't slow down change. We in fact accelerated change during the pandemic, because that's what you have. Like, in a time of such uncertainty, it doesn't make sense to make incremental changes. You got to swing big. So there's actually a great moment that I want to talk about that Adam touched on earlier, where you can lose people because of your culture. Well, when I talked about that academic moment when we had defined the culture but not implemented it, I lost a great developer. So I lost a great developer, and he gave a bunch of reasons, but the one that really, I think, was the reason he left was people were having conversations that he didn't feel were consistent with what he wanted in his life or at his job. Like, he wasn't motivated by his colleagues, because there was a bunch of background conversations that were ugly and inconsistent with our culture, and he left. And that was, unfortunately, the lightning bolt that actually made things happen. So that was in October when that happened. So we'd been building this thing for several months. We had the academic exercise locked down, and we hadn't really taken action. He left, and we said, you know what? These are now the rules of engagement at our company, and inconsistency is something we have to just run at to make sure that we're there. So I'm happy to say that we've made huge strides since then. And probably most importantly, like we've started designing interview questions around these three principles. So the new hires have been an absolute shot in the arm. Like good shot, vaccine shot, not a punch. And they are, new hires can absolutely help bolster new culture. And when you can get them consistent from day one, there's just so much to go on.
How do you specifically define a good culture fit as bench?
Yeah, great question. I mean, culture fit is the term that's falling out of fashion these days because it's prone to affinity bias. Like fit means like me, therefore good, which isn't what we want, right? So when I ask questions, I interview around these three principles. So we have a technical interview, we have what we call a process-related interview, and then I do the culture interview. And I have questions designed around these things. And it's not to see whether they fit, it's to assess where they are within these bounds. So like there are, you know, young engineers who've never thought beyond the code to the people that the technology is actually touching. That's okay. Then I can make an assessment where they're at in that category. Or in foster growth, there are people who've never had to have a conversation with anybody that is difficult. Okay, then they're probably a junior in terms of foster growth culture, right? It's more about assessing, and then we take those abilities in combination with their technical and their process know-how and et cetera, and we understand where they're at, and then decide whether or not this is somebody we want to invest in. I don't think there's anybody who can't learn this. There's some people who would have difficulty unlearning what they currently know. So that's something worth thinking about.
Here, in your experience, what would you say the approximate proportion of your employees and staff, present or past, that possess this growth mindset? What proportion of people would you rather be stationary?
There are no current employees in my org that do not have a growth mindset. That's on purpose. It's really easy, especially in the world of technology where it's so competitive to get anyone, to hire people with skills and a fixed mindset. It's just, you're just going to pay for it later, right? You're just acquiring culture debt. So just like folks at Wave were talking about, like growth is everything. If people aren't growing, they're costing you money. So if you have, we do a number system for engineers. So if you have an engineer 2, which is like an early intermediate, and they're not growing, well, then I'm spending this money on somebody who's not growing instead of spending the exact same amount of money on somebody who is, right? And which one's better for my business? So that's why foster growth is a thing. If people aren't growing, like one, we ask the question, okay, are you asking yourself, is this the best you can do? And 2, are we having the conversations that are required to ensure that you are growing?
How do you make sure your culture is adaptable during the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. This is where it can't just be an academic exercise, and you actually have to engage with people and practice. We've iterated on the, like, if you go to our handbook, you can look at the pull requests, and like we've changed things a lot. Because we are often faced with conversations that are like, oh, this one almost fits, or this one kind of does, like, where does this one fit? And like, then we're like, okay, we can generalize this principle, or we can add another principle or whatever. So pandemic or no, I think we'll keep doing that for forever. And the goal now is we've gotten to this level of expertise in our management layer, and where we need to get to is that same level of expertise on the front lines. So we need, you know, somebody who's been working at Bench for a year and has 2 years of experience to be looking at a conversation and saying, oh, that's why that doesn't work. That's where we need to get to if we're actually going to be high performing.
Suppose you have a high performing employee who buys into the culture and you want to retain him or her for the long term. What are your strategies for doing so? What are factors that keep you up at night about employee retention?
Yes, I've lost many nights of sleep over employee retention, and I actually lose less sleep now. The model that I use, or one of my favorites, Reid Hoffman has a thing that they did at LinkedIn called Tours of Duty. So they call it, there's an HBR article about it. It's really good. They call it the new employer-employee relationship. And essentially what you do is you talk to somebody, well, what's your goal? Like, what do you want out of this employment? So whether it's to grow to a certain level, or like I have a woman who told me straight to my face, she's like, if Apple offers me a job, I'm leaving tomorrow. And I said, awesome. And she said, well, I'm not ready yet. I was like, okay, let's get you ready for Apple. Let's make that the thing that we're doing, and we'll call success when you're ready for Apple. And that's a really awesome way to think about it. Like, as long as folks are growing, there's a certain amount of time, or there's a certain period of time where, it's like buying a house. Like there's a bunch of taxes and stuff, which, like, hiring costs money. If they're only there for a year, well, that's a big problem. You're going to lose money. If they're there for 2+ years and they're growing fast, that is a great relationship no matter what. So at that point, you just get to talk about how big your dream is and how big the opportunities are for a person, and design systems around that. So we have basically, like for us, for example, a lot of companies do this. We have career tracks for both individual contributors and managers. So there's no limit on your salary or your influence based on whether or not you want to be a manager. So that's a way to keep going. Google does this very well and very famously. Other than that, like, it's incredibly individual. But having the conversations to be like, okay, what is going to make you work here for 5 years? And, like, don't be afraid to use big numbers. Like, people in tech love working places for less than 2 years. God knows I've done it enough times. But what is it that can really make you stay for 5 years? I've been at Bench for 4 years now, but I've had like 4 jobs within Bench. And I'm not going anywhere because, God, I can see how big this opportunity is, and I think it's going to be fun.
What do you think the average tenure of anybody in tech is? I'm going to say if you can get 2 years out of someone, and I'm going to say this pretty confidently, I think I look at more profiles than anybody in this chat section. Recruiter, every day I'm looking at through LinkedIn, Indeed, there's hundreds of CVs a day sometimes. 2 years, if you can get 2 years out of someone, that's great. But what I usually find, it's 2 years, senior software developer, and then they're gone, and then they've taken. So I think if, like Bench have kind of quoted here, if you can grow and retain your staff and develop them, people leave for 3 reasons: money, they don't like their current employer, and growth, and interesting, challenging projects. So as a business, if you can foster and create what I call for my candidates tangible career benefits, if your company is providing you with those kind of development and growth opportunities, people won't leave. You talk a lot about a growth mindset. Does this have a line up with the growth of the company?
Yeah, I think that, like, Bench has had to reinvent itself each year for the last 2 years. 2 years ago, we almost ran out of money, which every company should do for a lot of reasons. It allows you to, it forces you to think about what's important and to either die or come out stronger. And fortunately, we came out stronger. So that was 2018, where we totally rethought the business. The way we basically made the shift at that point from being a venture capital funded business to a profitability focused business. And that has made huge changes for the freedom with which we've been able to act. And then we were in a great place, January 2020, and then we got smacked in the face by a pandemic, and we had to do it again. We were way better at it this time because we had already done it. And I'm just hoping we get through in April this year without having to rebuild our entire business. But the thing that, like, the reason we focus so much about culture is the only constant over the last 2, 3, 5 years has been our culture. We've had to completely rethink our strategy multiple times. Strategy results from great conversations and great culture. Execution results from great strategy, right? So culture is foundational to all this stuff. And yeah, I think growth is very much a foundational element of working at Bench.
How do you deal with employees that are combative with some of your culture principles?
Yeah, great question. You have a difficult conversation with them. So when I talked about the example of the guy who left and it, like, kind of put a fire under our butts to actually get something done, I had to have a couple of these conversations. And often they turn into quite a simple question, like, why do you work at Bench? And that's a really powerful thing. And those conversations are terrifying, especially with more senior employees, because they're one-way door conversations. You'll end up either with a stronger relationship with that person, or you won't have them as an employee anymore. And you have to be willing to walk down that road. I was 3 out of 4 keeping. 3 out of 4 stayed with us, and the other one I think was a lost cause. And there's nothing wrong with this employee. They just had different things that they wanted to do. I hold no grudges whatsoever. But those were terrifying conversations, especially with really experienced folks. When I said, what we're doing right now isn't working, and we need it to change if you're going to keep working here. And I'm here to support that. I'm also terrified to be having this conversation. And that's how. So deal with isn't really the right like that is a way you could think about it for sure, but it's you got to have a conversation that is consistent with your culture, and you got to live by the principles. And it doesn't matter how good they are, it doesn't matter how much they know. You need to step into that conversation if you're going to have a high performing team.